The dust of redemption settled in layers on window sills, in the grooves of wagon wheels, and in the lungs of men who breathed it their whole lives. It was a fine, gritty powder, the color of old blood, and it clung to everything. Lorenzo felt it on his tongue as he stood before the teller's cage at the Redemption Bank and Trust. The air inside was thick with the scent of oiled wood aging paper and the faint, cloying sweetness of the clerk's pomade. He slid a withdrawal slip under the brass grill. The sum was modest enough for seed salt and the wages for his one hired hand, a man named Jebediah, who spoke more to horses than to people. Lorenzo preferred it that way. He had come to this corner of the territory seeking the kind of quiet that sank into your bones, a silence so profound it might eventually drown out the echoes of the past. The clerk, a young man with a thin mustache and nervous eyes, counted out the coins with painstaking slowness. Outside, the midday sun hammered the street into a shimmering anvil. A horse whinnied, a dog barked, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday. Then a new sound cut through the drone, the sharp, deliberate click of a rifle's hammer being cocked. The bank's double doors swung inward, not with a bang, but with a whisper of deadly intent. 3 men filled the entrance, their faces obscured by dust-caked bandanas. A 4th man stepped through behind them, and he wore no mask. He didn't need one. His authority was a physical presence, a cold spot in the warm room. He was tall and lean, dressed in a tailored black coat that was immaculate despite the dust. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept the room with an unnerving, analytical calm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth and educated, carrying an almost pastoral cadence, "we find ourselves at a moment of transactional clarity. Your cooperation will be remembered as prudence, your resistance as folly." This was Silas Kane. Though Lorenzo did not yet know his name, he recognized the type of wolf who had mastered the language of shepherds. Panic, hot and sour, erupted. The clerk's hands froze over the stacks of coins. A woman in the corner let out a strangled gasp. Kane's men moved with chilling efficiency, one covering the door, the others moving to herd the patrons and staff against the far wall. Lorenzo remained where he was, his body tensing the old instincts, the ones he had tried to bury under years of solitude, and soil surfacing like a splinter, working its way out of old wood. "You, Sir Silas," said, his gaze landing on Lorenzo. His lips curled into a smile that held no warmth, only a predatory amusement. "It seems we've interrupted your business. Please step away from the counter." Lorenzo didn't move. His eyes were locked on Kane's. In that gaze, he felt a flicker of something beyond random criminality, a focused intensity that felt unnervingly personal. One of the masked men leveled a shotgun at him. "You heard him, old man. Move it." Slowly, deliberately, Lorenzo raised his hands and took a step back. He wasn't a lawman anymore. He was a rancher. His fight was with drought and blight, not with men like these. That was a promise he'd made to himself, a penance for a past failure that had cost more than just his career. The robbery was a masterpiece of cold-blooded precision. One man emptied the teller drawers into a canvas sack, while the other kept watch. Silas Kane did not participate in the labor. He merely observed his chilling presence, orchestrating the symphony of fear. He walked the length of the room, his boot heels clicking on the floorboards, his gaze lingering on the terrified faces. Wealth, he mused, as if delivering a lecture, is a current. It is meant to flow. When it pools in one place too long, it stagnates. We are simply encouraging circulation. His eyes met Lorenzo's again. That flicker was stronger now, a glint of recognition or purpose that Lorenzo couldn't place. A cold dread snaked up his spine. This wasn't just about money. The sack was full. The men began to back toward the door. It was almost over. But then the bank manager, a portly man named Henderson, with more courage than sense, made a desperate lunge from behind his desk, pulling a small derringer from a drawer. "Not another step," Henderson cried, his voice trembling but loud. Silas sighed a sound of genuine disappointment. "Folly," he whispered. The man nearest Henderson didn't hesitate. He swung his rifle, the butt cracking against Henderson's temple with a sickening thud. The manager crumpled. The derringer clattered to the floor unfired. In the ensuing chaos, another of the robbers, startled by the sudden violence, spun around his pistol, discharging with a deafening roar. The world seemed to slow. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. Lorenzo felt a violent, hammer-like blow to his chest, throwing him back against the wall. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs. He slid to the floor, a sharp metallic taste in his mouth, his vision tunneling into darkness. He heard the woman scream, the panicked shouts of the robbers, the thunder of boots as they fled. He clutched at his chest, expecting to feel the wet warmth of blood. His fingers met only the coarse fabric of his shirt, and beneath it, a hard, misshapen lump. He fumbled inside his breast pocket, his hand shaking. He pulled out a silver locket, oval-shaped and heavily tarnished. A deep, ugly dent marred its surface right over the hand-engraved initials of his late wife, Maria. The bullet was lodged in the silver. It had saved his life. He snapped it open. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, faded with time. On one side, Maria, her dark eyes full of a life that had been extinguished too soon. On the other, his daughter Lily, a smiling, gap-toothed child of 7. They had died in a fire, a tragic accident years ago, but the raid that had kept him away from home that night was no accident. It was a failure of his own, making a reckless choice that had cost him everything, including his partner. The locket was all he had left of them, a tangible piece of the life he had lost, and now it bore the scar of this new violence. The town sheriff, a weary, cynical man named Elias Thorne, helped him to his feet. "You're a lucky man," Lorenzo Thorne said, his voice raspy with dust and resignation. Lorenzo stared at the dented locket in his palm and the image of his daughter fractured by the impact. Lucky wasn't the word he would have chosen. Violated, marked. He felt as if the bullet had not just struck metal, but had pierced the fragile shell of the solitude he had built around himself, letting the ghosts of his past rush in. He gave his statement to Thorne, his words clipped and mechanical. He described the leader, the cold eyes, the eloquent speech. Thorne just shook his head. "Sounds like Silas Kane's work, a new breed of viper. Thinks he's some kind of prophet with a pistol." Lorenzo didn't care what Kane thought he was. He only knew that the man's violence had reached out and touched the one sacred thing he had left. The quiet he had sought felt impossibly distant now. He collected his horse, mounted, and rode out of Redemption, leaving the frantic noise of the town behind. He needed the vast, empty sweep of the prairie to quiet the storm in his head. He spurred his horse faster, wanting to outrun the acrid smell of gunpowder, the memory of Silas Kane's eyes, and the fresh, agonizing pain of a wound that had never truly healed. He rode until the sun began its slow, bleeding descent across the horizon, painting the mesas in hues of blood and rust. He wanted only to get back to his ranch, to the familiar weight of his chores, to the silence that had been his only companion. But the prairie had other plans. Just as the long shadows of dusk began to stretch across the grasslands, he saw it. A splash of lavender against the dun-colored earth, nestled in the shade of a lone cottonwood tree. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a woman lying broken and still. Beside her, 2 small figures, a girl standing guard, and a boy curled into a ball on the ground. Lorenzo reined in his horse, the creak of the leather, loud in the sudden stillness. His first instinct, raw and powerful, was to ride on. He had just survived a brush with death. He was reeling, his soul bruised. He had no room for the troubles of strangers. Trouble finds you whether you look for it or not. He thought the words a bitter mantra. He had just seen proof of it in town. But the girl, seeing him, rose unsteadily to her feet. She was no older than 6, her face smudged with dirt and tears, but her stance was one of defiant desperation. "Sir," she called out, her voice thin but clear, cutting through the vast emptiness. "Mama's dying. Please, please don't let her." Lorenzo looked from the girl's fierce, pleading eyes to the dented locket he still held clutched in his hand. He had just been saved by a memory, by the ghost of a family he couldn't protect. Now, a living, breathing family was before him, shattered and abandoned. The coincidence was too cruel, too pointed to ignore. The silence he craved suddenly felt like a coward's retreat. Helping them was a heavy, complex choice, an invitation to the very trouble he sought to escape. But as he looked at the woman's bruised face and the children's terror, he knew it wasn't a choice at all. It was a reckoning. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of both his past and his future, he dismounted. The prairie held its breath, waiting. The ranch house was less a home than an anchor, a heavy, unadorned structure Lorenzo had built to keep himself from drifting away entirely. Its weathered boards, silvered by years of sun and wind, rose from the land like a monument to solitude. As he rode through the gate, the weight of Elsie limp across his saddle felt immense. Her children, Ida and Anne, clung to him, their small bodies trembling their silence, a testament to a terror too deep for words. He carried Elsie inside his boots, echoing on the floorboards, that had only ever known the sound of his own solitary steps. The interior was sparse, functional, stripped of any comfort that might suggest a life lived rather than simply endured. A dark stove, a plain table, a single quilt folded over a chair. He laid her on his bed, the only one in the house, and pulled the quilt over her with a rough, unpracticed tenderness. Her breath was a shallow flutter, a fragile bird trapped in her chest. Ida, the small girl with the ancient eyes, immediately took charge. Her movements a miniature echo of a mother's care. She climbed onto a stool by the bed, her small hand brushing strands of matted hair from Elsie's bruised forehead. And the little boy pressed his face into the quilt, whispering, "Don't go, Mama," his voice muffled and thick with unshed tears. Lorenzo turned away, remembering the scene pressing on a locked part of his soul. He busied himself at the stove, the simple mechanical acts of grinding coffee and heating water, a defense against the wave of memories that threatened to crest over him. He remembered another small hand brushing back his wife's hair, another child's voice whispering in a quiet room. The hiss of the kettle was a welcome intrusion, pulling him back to the present. He brought a basin of warm water and a clean cloth to the bedside. He didn't speak, didn't offer. He simply set them down. Ida watched him, her gaze sharp and assessing, weighing his intentions. After a moment, she dipped the cloth, wrung it out with surprising strength, and began to gently clean her mother's face. Lorenzo retreated to the porch, leaving them to their private ritual. He had no place in that sacred circle of pain. The day bled into evening. From the porch he watched the children. Ida swept the floor with a broom twice her size, her small face set with grim determination. Anne discovered a clutch of hens behind the barn and spent an hour scattering crumbs for them, his brief delighted giggles the first sound of joy the ranch had heard in years. Lorenzo listened to that laughter, letting it seep into the cracks of his hardened heart. It was a foreign, unsettling sound, like hearing a forgotten language spoken fluently. The whispers he'd fled in town eventually found him here. His hired hand, Jebediah, rode in late in the afternoon. He saw the woman in the bed through the open door, his leathery face tightening with disapproval. "Found yourself a stray," Jebediah muttered, not looking Lorenzo in the eye. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near a fence post. Some strays carry diseases you can't see. Town's already talkin'. Says you're taking in baggage that'll ruin what's left of your name. Lorenzo's shoulders stiffened. He didn't turn. My name is my business. Just saying, Jebediah grumbled, turning to his work. Trouble's got a way of multiplying. Lorenzo knew that better than anyone. He had spent years running from it, only to find it waiting for him in a bank in Redemption and again under a cottonwood tree on the prairie. Perhaps he thought you didn't outrun trouble. You just chose which trouble was worth facing. That evening, Elsie woke fully. Lamplight cast soft, forgiving shadows across the room. She struggled to sit up, a sharp wince twisting her features. Lorenzo was there in an instant, his hand moving to steady her shoulder before he could think. She flinched violently at his touch, a raw instinctual recoil from the memory of a man's hand raised in anger. He withdrew his hand immediately, a self-reproachful heat rising in his neck. "Sorry," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Didn't mean to startle you." She looked away, shame burning on her bruised cheeks. "Thank you." She whispered the words, barely audible. "For this." He knew she wasn't just thanking him for the shelter. She was thanking him for pulling back, for understanding that her wounds were deeper than her skin. He gave a curt nod and returned to the stove, ladling broth into a bowl. He set it beside her without a word. Words were clumsy tools for this kind of work. Silence and action were better. She ate slowly, each spoonful a victory against pain and humiliation. Ida watched her mother with an unwavering intensity, a tiny sentinel guarding against the return of despair, and had fallen asleep on a folded coat in the corner, his small chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of exhaustion. The quiet in the room was thick with unspoken things. Finally, Elsie set the bowl aside. Her voice was raspy but firm. "We won't be a burden. I'll be strong enough to travel in a day or two." Lorenzo was cleaning a piece of tack, his hands moving with meticulous precision. He didn't look up. "Where will you go?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Elsie's gaze fell to her hands knotted in her lap. She had no answer. There was nowhere to go. He finally looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "You'll leave when you're healed?" he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Not when pride or fear pushes you out the door." Her eyes shot to his wide with surprise. A flicker of something, relief, maybe, or a terrifying spark of hope crossed her face before she could mask it. She lowered her gaze, but not before he saw the shimmer of tears. Later that night, long after the lamp had been extinguished, Lorenzo stood by the open door, staring out at the vast, star-dusted darkness. The prairie was a sea of black, indifferent, and eternal. He had once found comfort in its emptiness. Now, with the sound of a woman's quiet weeping and a child's soft sigh coming from the room behind him, it felt less empty, but infinitely more complicated. He could hear Elsie's muffled sobs broken by whispered fragments. "I have to leave. I can't stay. What will I do?" The words were a prayer to a heaven she no longer believed in. Lorenzo's hand tightened on the doorframe, his knuckles white in the moonlight. He was a man who had walled off his heart brick by painful brick. This woman and her children were a battering ram against those walls. He had made a decision on the prairie, a simple act of mercy. But now, listening to her despair, he understood that the initial act was the easiest part. The real test was what came next. He was no longer just a rescuer. He was becoming a protector, a guardian. It was a role he had failed at once before, with catastrophic consequences. The wind rose, pressing against the house, and in its mournful howl, he heard the echoes of his own past failures. The house stood firm against the wind, but Lorenzo wondered if he could do the same. A few days of quiet settled over the ranch, a fragile truce with the world. Under Lorenzo's roof, Elsie began to heal. The deep purple of her bruises softened to a pale yellow. The haunted look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a watchful weariness. She moved about the house with a quiet efficiency, mending Lorenzo's worn shirts, baking bread that filled the small cabin with a scent it hadn't known in years, her actions a silent thank you, an attempt to reclaim her own dignity by contributing. Lorenzo accepted these small domestic offerings with a gruff nod, but he watched her. He saw the strength returning to her spine, the way her hands, though still trembling at times, moved with purpose. He taught Ida how to properly hold the reins of his old gentle mare, his large, calloused hands covering her tiny ones. He watched N chase grasshoppers in the tall grass, the boy's uninhibited laughter, a sound that started to feel less like an intrusion and more like a necessity. This fragile peace was shattered by the need for supplies. The trip to redemption was unavoidable. Lorenzo hitched the wagon, his movements stiff. He knew what awaited them. Elsie, her face pale but resolved, insisted on coming. To hide would be to accept their judgment. The moment their wagon rolled down Redemption's main street, the town seemed to hold its breath and then exhale in a collective venomous whisper. Women on the boardwalk stopped their chatter, their eyes like sharp little stones. Men leaning against the mercantile straightened up their smirks, a mixture of pity and contempt. The story had already been written for them. Lorenzo, the grieving recluse, had taken in a fallen woman. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with unspoken accusations. Elsie kept her eyes downcast, her shopping list clutched in her hand. When the storekeeper asked about credit in a deliberately loud, sneering voice, Lorenzo stepped forward without a word and placed a stack of coins on the counter. The metallic clink was a sharp rebuke that silenced the room for a moment. But it was outside on the boardwalk that the cruelty became overt. A rancher's wife, a woman Lorenzo had known for years, said to her friend just loud enough for Elsie to hear, he could have had any decent woman in this county. Instead, he chose that one's baggage. Elsie flinched as if struck. Before Lorenzo could react, Ida, who stood clutching her mother's dress, stepped forward. Her small chin was lifted high. "My mama is not baggage," she declared, her child's voice ringing with a fierce, unwavering loyalty that stunned the onlookers into silence. "She's the strongest person I know." A flush of shame and pride burned in Elsie's cheeks. She quickly pulled Ida back, murmuring for her to be quiet, but the damage or the defiance was done. Lorenzo put a firm hand on Elsie's shoulder, guiding her and the children back to the wagon. He met the hostile stares of the townsfolk with an unblinking, stony gaze that offered neither apology nor explanation. His silence was a shield, and for the first time, Elsie felt protected by it rather than judged. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but the atmosphere in the wagon had shifted. The town's venom had not broken them. It had forged a fragile alliance. That night, after the children were asleep, Elsie found Lorenzo on the porch sharpening a knife by the faint light of a lantern. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "You shouldn't have to bear the town's scorn on my account." He didn't stop his work. Scorn is just noise. I've heard worse. He paused, then looked up at her, his eyes dark and serious. What they think matters less than what's true. He set the knife and stone aside. "I haven't asked what happened to you, Elsie. It's not my place. But I've seen men like them before. Their kind of trouble doesn't just go away." A shudder passed through her. She wrapped her arms around herself. "My husband, Jacob, he fell in with a bad crowd. Men who followed a charismatic leader. They promised him a share of something big. Jacob was a good man, but weak. He got in over his head. When he tried to back out, they made an example of him. Her voice broke. His family, they blamed me. Said I drove him to it. Said I shamed their name. She took a ragged breath. The leader of that gang. Jacob said he spoke like a preacher, always talking about balancing the scales of justice. He believed the world owed him something. A cold stillness settled over Lorenzo. Balancing the scales of justice. The phrase echoed in his mind, disturbingly familiar. It was the kind of philosophical poison Silas Kane might spew. He thought of the unnerving focus in Kane's eyes at the bank. He had dismissed it as the intensity of a predator. But what if it was something more? What if it was recognition? Before he could process the thought, a new threat emerged. Over the next week, small things began to go wrong at the ranch. A section of his northern fence was cut, allowing a dozen head of cattle to wander off. A trough was poisoned, killing a calf. Late one night, a bundle of oil-soaked rags was found smoldering near the barn. These were not random acts of vandalism. They were calculated, methodical acts of intimidation designed to pressure him to drive him off his land. Lorenzo knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone who was behind it. Silas Kane wasn't just a bank robber. He was methodically clearing out the ranchers in this valley. Lorenzo had heard the rumors families selling their land for a fraction of its worth after a string of bad luck. He had assumed it was just the harsh reality of the West. Now he saw the pattern. Kane wanted this land. He wanted all of it. And Lorenzo's ranch was standing in his way. The attacks grew bolder. One afternoon, while Lorenzo was rounding up his scattered cattle, 2 of Kane's men rode onto his property. They didn't draw their weapons. They just sat on their horses at the edge of his yard, watching the house where Elsie was hanging laundry with Ida and N playing nearby. It was a silent, naked threat. Elsie hurried the children inside her face, a mask of terror. That was the breaking point. This was no longer just about land. Kane was targeting the people under his protection. He was targeting his chance at a new life. Lorenzo rode out to meet them, his movements deliberate, his face grim. He stopped his horse a dozen yards away. "This is private property," he said, his voice dangerously low. One of the men, a brute with a scarred face, laughed. "Mr. Kane sends his regards. He's a collector of fine things. And he's taken a shine to this valley. He's made a generous offer for this plot. We suggest you take it." "I'm not selling," Lorenzo said. The man's smile faded. "That's a shame. Things have a way of getting lost out here. Cattle, barns, even people." The threat hung in the dry air. Lorenzo's hand drifted near the butt of his pistol. The old instincts, the ones he'd fought to suppress, were screaming now. He was a marshal again, facing down the scum of the earth. "Tell your boss," Lorenzo said, his voice like flint striking steel, "that he has mistaken me for a man who can be frightened. Now get off my land before you get carried off it." The men exchanged a look, surprised by the cold steel in his voice. They held his gaze for a long moment, then with a sneer, they turned their horses and rode away. Lorenzo watched them go, but he felt no victory. This was just the beginning. The fight was no longer about defending a stranger. It was about defending his home. And as he looked back at the house where Elsie stood watching from the window, he realized that for the first time in a very long time, the word home meant more than just land and timber. It meant the people inside. Silas Kane hadn't just started a range war. He had declared war on Lorenzo's fragile, budding hope for a future. And Lorenzo would not let him win. The days that followed were taut with a new kind of tension. Lorenzo patrolled his fence lines with a rifle resting in the crook of his arm, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Every distant dust cloud, every hawk's cry was a potential threat. The idyllic peace of the ranch had been replaced by the grim atmosphere of a siege. Inside the house, Elsie fought her own battle against fear. She tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for the children, but her hands trembled as she kneaded dough, and she started at every unexpected sound. The brief, hopeful bond she and Lorenzo had begun to form was now strained by the shared weight of this danger. Their conversations became clipped and practical, focused on security and supplies. The unspoken affection between them was buried under a layer of grim necessity. Lorenzo knew he needed to understand his enemy. He rode into redemption, leaving Jebediah to stand guard. In the dusty office of Sheriff Thorne, he laid out his suspicions. It's Kane. He's the one behind the fence cutting the poisoned trough. Thorne leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. He ran a weary hand over his face. Lorenzo, I know you're seeing shadows, but I can't arrest a man for bad luck. Silas Kane is smart. He owns half the businesses in this town now. He's got the judge in his pocket. He's untouchable unless I catch him with a smoking gun in his hand, and men like him are too clever for that. So you're going to do nothing? Lorenzo's voice was tight with frustration. I'm going to do what I can. Thorne retorted, his own frustration showing. Which is damn little. You're on your own out there. Kane is playing a long game. He's trying to isolate you, make you desperate enough to sell. Lorenzo left the sheriff's office with a cold knot in his stomach. Thorne was right. This wasn't a straightforward fight. It was a war of attrition. He began his own investigation, speaking quietly with other ranchers who had recently sold their land. Their stories were all the same, a string of escalating misfortunes followed by a generous cash offer from a proxy buyer representing Kane's interests. One evening, a former rancher, a man named Peters, whose spirit had been broken, let something slip. The man who bought me out. He said something odd. Said his boss was a man of principle. Said he was just correcting an old injustice. The phrase struck Lorenzo like a physical blow. Correcting an old injustice. Silas Kane's eloquent justifications were more than just a cover for greed. There was an ideology behind his cruelty, a personal crusade. Lorenzo began to dig into his own past, into the one great injustice that haunted his every waking moment, the disastrous raid that had cost his partner Daniel his life. The raid had been on the hideout of the infamous Clanton gang. Lorenzo, then a U.S. Marshal, had been the lead. He had received a tip about the hideout's location, but his gut told him it was too easy. Daniel, his partner and closest friend, had urged caution. But Lorenzo, eager for a decisive victory after a long and bloody pursuit, had overruled him. He had been reckless. The tip was a trap. They rode into a perfectly orchestrated ambush. Daniel was killed in the first volley of gunfire. Lorenzo survived, but he retired in disgrace, the word reckless branded on his soul. Could Kane be connected to the Clantons? It seemed impossible. They were common thugs, not philosophical manipulators. Yet the feeling that this was personal, that Kane's eyes had held a spark of recognition, gnawed at him. The clues were scant, maddeningly ephemeral. Elsie, trying to help, recalled another detail about the gang her husband had joined. Jacob mentioned their brand. She said one night her brow furrowed in concentration. It was unusual, not for cattle. A personal mark the men used. It was a serpent coiled around a scale. Lorenzo froze. A serpent and a scale. A symbol of twisted justice. It was a brand he had seen before years ago, sketched in a case file. It was the mark of a small, vicious outfit that had been absorbed by the Clanton gang just before the final raid. It was a loose end, a detail no one had thought important at the time. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture so monstrous he could hardly bear to look at it. He saddled his horse and rode to the abandoned Peters Ranch, now owned by Kane. He searched the outbuildings, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and certainty. In the back of the barn, half hidden under a pile of old burlap sacks, he found it. A discarded saddle blanket, and burned into the corner of the leather was the faint but unmistakable image of a serpent coiled around a scale. He stood there in the dusty silence of the abandoned barn, the blanket in his hand, and the truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about his land. It was never about the land. This was about the ambush. This was about the Clanton gang. This was about Daniel. Silas Kane was connected to that day. This entire campaign of terror, the bank robbery, the harassment, the slow, methodical isolation, it was all for him. This was revenge. He rode back to his ranch, the world seeming to tilt on its axis. The fight had changed. He was no longer just protecting his home and his new family. He was facing a ghost from his past, a ghost who had come to collect an old and terrible debt. Silas Kane, realizing Lorenzo would not be broken by proxy, escalated his campaign. His strategy shifted from intimidation to isolation, aiming to turn the entire community of redemption against the lone rancher. He began to poison the well of public opinion with carefully crafted rumors. Lorenzo was an unstable recluse, a danger to the community. The woman he harbored was a magnet for trouble. The first direct move was subtle. The feed store, recently acquired by one of Kane's holding companies, suddenly and inexplicably lost Lorenzo's credit line. The blacksmith, indebted to Kane's bank, found himself too busy to shoe Lorenzo's horses. One by one, the doors of redemption began to close on him. The final, most vicious stroke came when a small fire broke out in the town's livery stable. No one was hurt, but the threat of a larger blaze terrified the citizens of the dry wooden town. The next morning, Sheriff Thorne arrived at the ranch, his face grim. With him was a deputy and one of Kane's men, a man named Cole, who stood back with a smug look on his face. "Cole here says he saw you," Thorne said, his voice flat and official. "Riding away from the livery just before the fire started." "That's a lie," Lorenzo said, his voice a low growl. "I was here all night." "Can anyone vouch for that?" Thorne asked. Lorenzo looked toward the house. Elsie stood in the doorway, her face pale. Her word, the word of a so-called fallen woman, would be worthless against the calculated lie of one of Kane's men. To involve her would be to drag her deeper into the town's contempt. "No," Lorenzo said, his jaw tight. "I need you to come into town," Thorne said, "just to answer some questions." It was a trap. Lorenzo knew that once he was in a cell, his ranch would be defenseless. Kane could move and drive Elsie and the children off and claim the property unopposed. "I'm not going anywhere." Elias, Lorenzo said, his hand resting on the porch railing inches from the shotgun he kept there. Thorne's eyes flickered from Lorenzo's face to the shotgun and back. He sighed a deep, weary sound. "Don't make me do this, Lorenzo. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." From the doorway, Elsie's voice, clear and steady, cut through the tense standoff. "He was here, Sheriff. He was with me. All night." All three men turned to look at her. She stepped out onto the porch, her chin high, her gaze unwavering, as she met Thorne's eyes. She was no longer the hesitant, fearful woman Lorenzo had found on the prairie. She was claiming her place, standing her ground, and in doing so, she was publicly binding her fate to his. Cole sneered, but Thorne had the decency to look uncomfortable. Her testimony wouldn't hold up in a corrupt court, but it was enough to make the sheriff hesitate. "I'm telling you the truth, Sheriff," she said. Thorne studied her face, then Lorenzo's. He seemed to weigh his duty against his own weary conscience. Finally, he shook his head. This is a mess, Lorenzo. Kane is twisting this town into a knot. Watch your back. He turned and left the deputy, and a scowling Cole following him. The immediate threat had passed, but the damage was done. The accusation, however baseless, would stick. Lorenzo was now officially a pariah, a suspected arsonist. He was completely alone, walled off from the town, with only his own strength and the fierce loyalty of the family he had accidentally created to rely on. The isolation was complete. Silas Kane had him exactly where he wanted him. That night, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind began to rise, not with the clean rush of a prairie breeze, but with a low, mournful howl that scraped at the corners of the house. A sandstorm was coming. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an oppressive energy. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable violence to break. Lorenzo secured the barn and the livestock, his movements quick and efficient. He knew this storm was the perfect cover for an attack. As darkness fell, the wind became a physical force, hurling sand and grit against the wooden walls of the house, with the sound of 1,000 tiny claws. Visibility dropped to near zero. The world outside the windows was a roiling, chaotic blur of brown dust. Suddenly, Jebediah, who had been patrolling the perimeter, burst through the door, his face wild with alarm. "They're coming, Lorenzo. A half-dozen of them at least. They used the storm for cover." Lorenzo's blood ran cold. He had expected an attack on the ranch, not an outright invasion. "Elsie, take the children to the root cellar. Bar the door from the inside and don't open it for anyone but me. Do you understand?" Her eyes were wide with terror, but she nodded, herding a crying N and a stoic Ida toward the cellar trapdoor in the floor. "This is it then," Jebediah said, checking the load in his rifle. "No," Lorenzo said, his mind racing. "This is a diversion. He doesn't want the ranch. He wants me. And he wants an audience." He looked out the window at the swirling chaos. Kane wouldn't stage his final act of revenge here in the dark, where no one could see it. He would want a stage. He would want the town. He's not coming here, Lorenzo realized with dawning horror. He's going into redemption. He's going to take the town hostage to draw me out. But he was wrong. The attack on the ranch was real. Gunshots exploded from the darkness, splintering the wood of the doorframe. Jebediah returned fire from a window. Lorenzo knew he was pinned down. He couldn't leave. Then a new sound cut through the howl of the wind, and the crack of rifles, the frantic ringing of the town's church bell, a universal signal for dire emergency. It was a desperate, panicked clang, barely audible over the storm. Kane had split his forces. He was pinning Lorenzo down at the ranch, while his main force took the town. But why? A horrifying thought struck him. The bell. It wasn't to draw him out. It was to draw someone else in. Elsie's in-laws. He'd heard they were in town preparing a legal challenge to get the children. Kane knew. He had been watching everything. He wasn't after the town. He was after the children. He was going to strip Lorenzo of his new family, just as Lorenzo had stripped him of his. The plan was diabolical, and it was already in motion. The howl of the sandstorm was a physical scream, a raging, blinded beast clawing at the world. Inside the Redemption Saloon, the air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey fear, and the fine, gritty dust that seeped through every crack in the walls. Lanterns cast a grotesque, wavering light, making shadows dance like phantoms. The townspeople, a dozen men and women who had been caught out when the storm hit, were huddled together, their faces pale masks of terror. And in the center of it all, holding them captive, was Silas Kane. He had Elsie, Ida, and N. He had timed his move with surgical precision. While a handful of his men pinned Lorenzo down at the ranch, Kane and his core group had slipped into the chaos of the town. They hadn't taken the whole town hostage, only the saloon. But they had taken what mattered most. He had found Elsie and the children seeking shelter there, and now he held them as the final pieces in his long and patient game of revenge. A grandfather clock in the corner of the saloon ticked with relentless, maddening slowness, each second a hammer blow against the screaming wind. Lorenzo arrived like a wraith out of the storm, his face covered by a bandana, his duster whipped around him by the gale. He had broken through the siege at his ranch, leaving Jebediah to hold the line and ridden with a desperate, reckless fury. He dismounted outside the saloon, the church bell still tolling its frantic, unheard alarm. The batwing doors creaked open before he could touch them. Silas Kane stood framed in the doorway, a pistol held loosely at his side. He smiled that same chilling intellectual smile from the bank. "I knew you would come, Marshal," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the roar of the wind. "A man of your character could do nothing else." Lorenzo stepped inside, pulling the bandana from his face. His eyes immediately found Elsie and the children held in a corner by two of Kane's men. Elsie's face was a portrait of defiant terror, her arms wrapped around her children. Ida stared at Lorenzo, her small face conveying a desperate, unwavering faith that he could fix this. "Let them go, Kane," Lorenzo said, his voice a low growl. "This is between you and me." "Oh, it is," Silas agreed, stepping aside to let Lorenzo fully enter the room. "It always has been. But you see, martial justice requires balance. An eye for an eye. A family for a family. You took my brother from me. I am simply returning the favor." The saloon fell into a deeper silence, the townsfolk staring their fear momentarily forgotten in the face of this stark revelation. Lorenzo felt the floor drop out from under him. "My brother." Daniel. The name was a cracked whisper torn from his throat. Daniel Kane. Silas affirmed, his voice laced with a cold, simmering venom that had been hidden beneath his calm exterior. "My younger brother. The one you led into a slaughter because you were too arrogant to listen, too reckless to see the trap for what it was. You were his partner, his friend. You were supposed to protect him." Flashes of the ambush seared Lorenzo's mind, the sudden hail of bullets, the look of shock on Daniel's face, the guilt that had been his constant companion ever since. It was all true. He had been reckless. He had led his friend to his death. "He thought you were a hero," Silas continued, pacing slowly before the bar, his movements as graceful as a stalking panther. "He wrote me letters about you, about your courage, your conviction. But your conviction was just a mask for pride. You sacrificed him for your own glory." "That's not what happened," Lorenzo gritted out, though the words felt hollow even to him. "Isn't it?" Silas stopped, turning to face him. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. "This is an affidavit signed and sworn by the only surviving member of the Clanton gang from that day. He testifies that he met with you before the raid. He states that you knowingly and intentionally led your partner into a trap in exchange for a portion of their hidden gold." He held up the paper. It was a lie, a monstrous, fabricated lie. But in the corrupt, Kane-controlled courts of this territory, it would be a death sentence. Not just for his freedom, but for his name, for the very memory of who he had been. "I'm offering you a choice." Lorenzo. Silas said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You can die here tonight a villain, or you can sign over your ranch, disappear, and I will burn this document. Your new family goes free. Your reputation, what's left of it, remains intact. You will be a coward, but you won't be a murderer. What will it be, a bullet or a pen? This was the true nature of his revenge. Not just to kill Lorenzo, but to destroy his soul. To force him into a corner where the only way to save the people he loved was to become the monster Silas claimed he was. The physical stakes, the guns, the hostages were secondary. The environmental stakes, the screaming wind that isolated them, the ticking clock on the wall, were just scenery. The real battle was here, in this moral crucible. Lorenzo looked at Elsie. Her eyes pleaded with him, but not with fear for her own life. She was afraid for him, for the choice he was being forced to make. He saw her strength, the quiet dignity she had fought so hard to reclaim. He saw Ida, whose belief in him was a burning light in the dim room. To run to accept Cain's deal would be to betray that belief. It would be to prove Silas right. He was no longer the reckless man from his past. The last few weeks caring for Elsie, protecting the children, facing down the town's scorn, had changed him. He had learned patience. He had learned restraint. He had learned that true strength wasn't about winning, but about enduring. He slowly raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. All right, Cain, you win. A triumphant smirk flickered across Silas's face. A wise decision. The pen then. No, Lorenzo said, his voice steady. He looked past Silas, his gaze locking with the bartender, a man named O'Malley, who was frozen behind the bar. The clock. Silas frowned, confused. What? The clock on the wall, Lorenzo said, never breaking his gaze with O'Malley. It's running slow. By about 5 minutes. For a fraction of a second, every eye in the room, including Silas's and his men's, darted toward the grandfather clock in the corner. It was the opening he needed. In that heartbeat of distraction, Lorenzo's hand dropped from the air, his pistol clearing its holster in a single fluid motion, born of years of practice. He didn't fire at Silas. He fired at the large ornate lantern hanging from a chain directly above him. The bullet shattered the lantern's glass housing. Burning oil and glass rained down. Silas cried out, stumbling back, shielding his eyes. The room was plunged into near total darkness, the only light now coming from the faint, flickering lamps near the far walls and the ghostly glow of the storm outside. Chaos erupted. Lorenzo dove behind an overturned card table as one of Cain's men fired blindly into the darkness where he had been standing. The townsfolk screamed and scrambled for cover. In the disorienting gloom, Lorenzo was in his element. He was no longer a rancher. He was the marshal moving through the shadows, his senses sharpened by the adrenaline and the roar of the storm. He could hear Cain shouting orders, trying to restore control, but it was too late. The fight was on Lorenzo's terms now. He wouldn't kill Silas. That would be the old Lorenzo's way, the reckless way. He would disarm, and dismantle his revenge piece, by painstaking piece proving in the heart of the storm that he was not the man his past had condemned him to be. The saloon was a maze of shouting darkness and splintering wood. Lorenzo moved with a predator's economy, using the roar of the wind to mask the sound of his footsteps. One of Cain's men, disoriented, loomed out of the shadows near the bar. Lorenzo didn't shoot. He struck the man's gun hand with the heavy barrel of his own pistol, a sharp crack of bone echoing in the gloom. The man howled and dropped his weapon. Across the room, the second gunman was trying to keep his pistol trained on Elsie and the children, who were crouched behind a thick wooden pillar. "Stay where you are," he shrieked, his voice thin with panic. Lorenzo saw his chance. He grabbed a heavy whiskey bottle from the bar and hurled it into the far corner of the room. It shattered against the wall. The gunman, his nerves frayed, instinctively spun and fired at the sound. In that moment, his back was to Lorenzo. Lorenzo closed the distance in 2 long strides, tackling the man to the floor, disarming him with brutal efficiency. Now it was just him and Silas. Show yourself. Lorenzo Kane's voice boomed, laced with fury. He stood near the center of the room, a dark silhouette against the dust-choked light from the windows. Face me like a man. I'm not the man you think I am, Kane Lorenzo called out from the shadows. I made a mistake that day. A terrible mistake. I live with it every morning I wake up and every night I close my eyes. But I didn't murder your brother. And I won't murder you. He was drawing Silas's attention, pulling him away from Elsie and the children, giving them a chance to retreat further into the darkness. You'll pay for what you did, Silas roared, firing a shot in the direction of Lorenzo's voice. The bullet tore through the wall inches from where Lorenzo was crouched. Lorenzo broke cover not to attack, but to move toward the center of the room, drawing Silas into the open. As Kane turned, Lorenzo kicked a fallen spittoon, sending it skittering across the floor. The metallic clang made Silas flinch. It was a simple diversion, but it was enough. Lorenzo lunged not for Kane's gun, but for his arm. They grappled in the dim, chaotic light, a desperate, violent struggle. Silas was strong, wiry, fueled by years of hatred. But Lorenzo was stronger, his power rooted in a grim, hard-won resolve. He twisted Silas's arm, forcing the pistol from his grasp. It clattered to the floor. For a moment they stood chest to chest, their ragged breaths mingling in the dusty air. It's over, Lorenzo panted. Silas's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. With a final desperate snarl, he drove his knee into Lorenzo's side. As Lorenzo doubled over in pain, Silas lunged not for the gun, but for the false affidavit which had fallen to the floor. He snatched it up, a triumphant gleam in his eye. You may have won the fight, he hissed, but I'll still win the war. Your name will be mud forever. Just then, the saloon's batwing doors burst inward with a tremendous crash, not from a man, but from the full pent-up fury of the storm. The sandstorm, as if on cue, was beginning to break. A blast of wind and sand tore through the room, extinguishing the remaining lamps and sending papers and debris flying. The false affidavit was ripped from Silas's grasp. It fluttered in the air for a single dramatic moment before being sucked out into the raging darkness, lost forever to the storm. Silas stared, his mouth agape, as the evidence of his ultimate victory vanished into the night. His entire elaborate scheme, his final perfect revenge, was gone. He sank to his knees, a broken man defeated not by a bullet, but by the wind itself. The storm's fury began to subside as quickly as it had risen. The hellish howl softened to a mournful sigh. In the sudden ringing quiet, a new sound emerged, the heavy, determined footsteps of Sheriff Thorne, and a posse of townsmen drawn by the sounds of the fight, their lanterns cutting through the settling dust. They found a scene of ordered chaos. Lorenzo stood bruised but resolute over the kneeling form of Silas Kane. Elsie was comforting her children. The townsfolk were emerging from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of awe and relief. Thorne took in the scene, his weary eyes missing nothing. Lorenzo, what in God's name happened here? Lorenzo didn't try to hide or dissemble. He was done with secrets. He picked up Silas's pistol and handed it to the sheriff, but first. He's Daniel Kane's brother, Lorenzo said, his voice clear and steady, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. He came here for revenge. He blames me for his brother's death. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the confession he had held inside for years, finally breaking free. And he's not entirely wrong. I was the commanding officer on that raid. I was reckless. My pride got my partner killed. That's the truth. I've been running from it for years. He looked directly at Sheriff Thorne, his gaze unflinching. Whatever consequences come from that, I'll accept them. But his other claims, the arson, the conspiracy, those were lies to isolate me. to destroy me. A murmur went through the assembled townsfolk. They had seen Lorenzo as a pariah, a threat. Now, hearing his raw, unvarnished confession, contrasted with the memory of Silas Cain's manipulative cruelty, they saw something else entirely: a flawed but honorable man. His honesty in that moment was more powerful than any lie Cain could have concocted. Elsie moved to his side, her hand finding his. She didn't speak, but her presence was a silent, unwavering declaration of support. He had stood for her, and now she would stand for him. Thorn looked from Lorenzo's resolute face to the defeated, hollowed-out expression on Silas Cain's. He had seen enough lies in his life to recognize the hard, painful shape of the truth. "Get him on his feet," Thorn ordered his deputy, gesturing to Silas. "Put him in a cell. We'll sort this out in the morning." As Cain was hauled away, his crusade of vengeance ending not with a bang, but with the quiet clicks of handcuffs, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds. The storm had passed. The air washed clean by the wind, and rain felt new. Lorenzo stood with Elsie, Ida, and En, watching the sun rise over a town that looked at him with new eyes. He had faced his past not by outgunning it, but by owning it. The fight for his land was over. The fight for his soul had been won. Months passed. The prairie healed from the storm, a carpet of new green grass covering the scars. The wheels of justice, though slow and sometimes crooked, had turned. With Lorenzo's confession and the testimony of the townsfolk from the saloon, Silas Cain was tried and convicted, his web of deceit and intimidation unraveling under the weight of the truth. He was sentenced to life in the territorial prison, his assets seized. Lorenzo, after a formal inquiry, was cleared of the false charges. The truth of his partner's death was officially recorded, a tragedy born of a tactical error, not malice. The weight of his guilt remained a permanent part of him, but it was no longer a secret, shameful burden. It was a scar he could bear openly. Life on the ranch found a new rhythm, one of quiet contentment. Lorenzo, Elsie, Ida, and En were a family forged not by blood, but by shared trial and quiet understanding. The silence of the house was now filled with Ida's questions, En's laughter, and the soft murmur of conversation between a man and a woman who had found in each other a solace they thought long lost. One clear autumn afternoon, when the cottonwood leaves had turned to gold, Lorenzo took the dented silver locket from a box where he kept it. He walked to a small rise overlooking the pasture, a place where the view stretched out to the endless horizon. He had brought a sapling, a young cottonwood tree, and with his own hands, he dug a hole in the rich earth. He held the locket one last time, looking at the faded portraits of his first wife and daughter, their images fractured by Silas Cain's bullet. He had carried them in his heart, a shrine of grief that had kept him locked in the past. Now it was time to let them rest. He placed the locket in the bottom of the hole, a final tender goodbye. This act wasn't about forgetting. It was about honoring. It was about making space for a new future to grow. He gently placed the sapling over it, packing the earth firmly around its fragile roots. Elsie came and stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. Together, they watered the new tree. It was a promise of life of shade for future generations, a living monument to both the love that was lost and the love that was found. As they walked back to the house, Sheriff Thorne rode into the yard, a letter in his hand. "This just arrived for the town council, but I thought you should see it first, Lorenzo." It was an official notice from the territorial government. A portion of Silas Cain's seized assets had been liquidated and placed into a restitution fund. The families he had ruined, the ranchers he had forced out, would be repaid, their land offered back to them. Cain's legacy of ruin would be undone, his ill-gotten wealth used to rebuild the very community he had sought to corrupt. Redemption would have a chance to live up to its name. Lorenzo looked from the letter to the ranch house, where Ida and N were playing on the porch, their laughter carrying on the crisp autumn air. He looked at Elsie, her face glowing in the late afternoon sun, her eyes full of a quiet, steady love. He had come to this land seeking emptiness, a place to bury his past. Instead, he had found a future. He had found a home. He had found peace, not the silence of solitude, but the hard-won, beautiful peace of a life rebuilt from ashes.